Yes, I hope to shed some light on, as Pierce finished there, the relationship perhaps between militant Islam, political Islam, the British Empire, and Winston Churchill's role in this. I suppose, as an American, when you think of the British Empire, the first person that probably comes to your mind is Winston Churchill, and he is inexorably linked that way to the British Empire. And if you look at his lifespan from 1874, through the 1960s, you see the changes that take place over time through the British Empire, and you see basically the British Empire go from its zenith of power through decolonization and ultimate dissolution or de-evolution, and so I think Churchill and his lifespan becomes a good window through which to view the British Empire, and especially its relationship with the Islamic world. I think it's very important as well to point out that the Islamic world during this time span of Winston Churchill's life was also undergoing several changes. For instance, during this time, it started to become nationalized. It rose up from sort of the oppression of the Ottoman Empire, only to be oppressed by the British Empire. And then it eventually sort of tried to spring free from the British Empire. So you have two sort of things in flux, changing. And yet, it's not Islam itself as a religion isn't totally distinct from the British Empire either. It's not. It has a role of an other within the empire, but it's still a part of the British Empire. A census, and Pierce touched on this briefly, a census in 1880s concluded that there were actually twice as many Muslims under the rule of the Queen than there were actually under the Caliph in Constantinople at the time. In 1910, the official census put 62 million Muslims in India and 10 million Muslims in Egypt, both under control, of course, of the Queen, and only sort of 22 million in Turkey. So you have a situation where Islam is very much a part of the British Empire. And it is for this reason that it's important to look at Winston Churchill's relationship with Islam, for the several reasons that I'll go on to outline today. But what's interesting about his relationship with the Islamic world, I think, is that today his sort of relationship with the Islamic world has been hijacked. And has been sort of manipulated by neoconservatives, reactionaries, people on the left, on the far right, and if actually not just the far right of Britain, but also the far right in Islamic centers and in Arabic groups. So what they do is they typically take a quote, and I know many people here have heard this taught before, and I apologize for that, but I do feel like we should hear the quote in its entirety, and I'll take you through and I'll show you why this quote is misleading, and then we'll move forward to see what Churchill's views actually were. So this quote that I'm about to say comes from his book, The River War, the first edition, which only ran for 1 year. And this particular quote was taken out, and it's become popular since the invasion of Iraq. And Winston Churchill's grandson, whose name is also Winston Churchill, used this quote. Now, it's interesting from my perspective to know that Winston Churchill, the grandson, was also a journalist, and he was also an outspoken supporter of the invasion of Iraq and was quite cozy with neoconservatives. Anyway, let me continue with the quote. How dreadful are the curses of Mohammedanism? How dreadful are the curses which Mohammedanism lays on its voluntaries. Besides the fanatical frenzy, which is as dangerous in a man as hydrophobia in a dog, there is a fearful fatalistic apathy. The effects are apparent in many countries. Imprudent habits, slovenly systems of agriculture, sluggish methods of commerce, and insecurity of property exist wherever followers of the prophet rule or live. A degraded sensualism deprives this life of its grace and refinement, and the next of its dignity and sanctity. The fact that in Mohammedan law, every woman must belong to some man as an absolute property, either as a child, a wife, or a concubine, must delay the final extinction of slavery until the faith of Islam has ceased to be a great power among men. Individual Muslims may show splendid qualities. Thousands have become brave and loyal soldiers of the Queen, and all know how to die. But the influence of the religion paralyzes the social development of those who follow it. No stronger retrograde force exists in the world. Far from being moribund, Mohammedanism is militant and proselytizing faith. It has already sped throughout Central Africa, raising fearless warriors at every step. Were it not that Christianity is sheltered in the strong arms of science, the science against which it has vainly struggled, the civilization of modern Europe might fall, as well as did the civilization of ancient Rome. Now, these are pretty strong words from Winston Churchill about Islam. But what's particularly interesting about this quote is that it was doctored in some way when it was originally released by the grandson, Winston Churchill, to leave out the lines, in particular, "Thousands have become brave and loyal soldiers of the Queen." So that instantly creates a sort of problematic issue with how this quote's presented, because the original quote, Churchill does at least leave the idea that that Muslims who belong to what Churchill thought of as a martial race also fought for the Queen. So you have that sort of exception as well, and it leaves out the bit at the end where Churchill basically doesn't separate or put Christianity on a pedestal and says it only exists or has only been successful because of its relationship with science, which it has vainly struggled against. So you have this situation where the quote itself has been doctored, and it's sort of taken out of context. Now, here it does sound, Churchill saves his most damning quote specifically throughout the book, specifically on the dervish, who were followers of the Mahdi, who followed the Mahdi. And the Mahdi, I'll come right back to that. The Mahdi, which means the guided one. Now, his name was Muhammad Ahmed, and Muhammad Ahmed had declared himself the Mahdi, which is essentially, in Islam, is basically saying that you're the Messiah or the anointed one. So you have a situation where Churchill later referred to in History of the English-speaking peoples, he referred to the Mahdi and the dervish as sort of fanatics. Well, this is actually in line with what the Arabic ulmas were saying in Orthodox Islam, so that the caliphate was also issuing these ideas that the dervish were fanatics and that they needed to be sort of dealt with and controlled, which is not that far from what Churchill himself was saying. The other thing that's quite interesting, I'm going to just go back to this. If you probably can't see it here, on the outside of the book, in this particular edition, is the destroyed tomb of the Mahdi, which was destroyed during the Battle of Omdurman. And Churchill greatly criticized the way the British carried out that particular battle because of its brutal nature and because they destroyed the Mahdi's tomb, and he criticizes Kitchener. Now, his criticisms of Kitchener is probably why Churchill had this edition of the River War went off the market in one year, and he the next year released a version of this book that took out many chapters, including the passage that I've just read. So you have another situation where this isn't really, Churchill sort of changed his story a little bit there. So you and that combined with the creative editing of Winston Churchill paints a very specific picture of the way Winston Churchill felt about the Islamic world, when in fact it's actually a much more complex view, and that's what I'm sort of trying to demonstrate. So what were Churchill's views of, well, if we start with Islam, I thought David Kessler pointed out yesterday it's very important to remember that Islam is a religion and not an ethnic group. I've used the term Islamic world because it sort of represents how Churchill saw the world, I think. But if you look at how Churchill examines the world, or how he thinks of Islam, there's Islam inside the British Empire and Islam outside the British Empire. And it creates a sort of dual understanding of Islam and the Islamic world. So within the British Empire, you think of British India, Egypt, and as Piers pointed out, one of Churchill's favorite sayings actually was that the British Empire was the greatest Mohammedan power in the world. But this also blends with Churchill sort of a paternalistic Orientalism, and that Churchill felt very much responsible for the fate of the Muslims in the British Empire in a very sort of patronizing way, and he referred to them, in fact, as children of the empire, no different from children of their own in the 1930s during his campaign to keep India within the empire. So this is slightly different than how he viewed Islam outside the empire, because he recognized the Ottoman Empire as a sort of power structure, and as a conservative, as a sort of someone who inherited his father's sort of political legacy, he desperately sort of tried to prop the Ottoman Empire up to begin with prior to the First World War. He even threatened to fight on the side of the Ottomans against the Greeks in the Greco-Turkish War of 1897, which fizzled out before he was able to. But he had this sort of Victorian notion, which is linked in, I think, to this, what I'm describing as Tory Ottomanism. But he had this Victorian notion of a romantic view of Islam. So the idea of the noble Arab Bedouin, and that was somehow in his mind superior to the Muslims inside the British Empire. But just going back a second to reflect on what Churchill felt about the religion of Islam itself, the truth of the matter is he probably very rarely reflected on it at all. He exchanged letters with J.E.C. Weldon, who was his headmaster at Harrow while he was serving in India. And the two of them were debating in a correspondence about the nature of missions and missionary work. And as Pierce rightly pointed out, Churchill thought it was a complete waste of time. He believed that each religion had sort of evolved in its space and it best served the people where the religion had sprung up. And that was sort of the end of it for Churchill. So Churchill didn't spend a lot of time thinking about the religious components of Islam. In fact, later as colonial secretary in the 1920s, he had to ask what the difference between Shia and Sunni was. Now, perhaps it's telling that he had the presence of mind to ask the difference. Not many people would have in the 1920s, I wouldn't suspect. But he still had to ask the difference. So his appreciation of Islamic culture and of Islam was always aesthetic and always sort of Victorian and sort of Orientalist in its conception. And so if we sort of move forward that, how Churchill sort of starts developing, his ideas start evolving about the Islamic world clearly comes from his time on the northwest frontier in India. And during this time, Churchill fought with several Muslims. And there's a wonderful passage in My Early Life where he says, he's discussing on the language barrier between, he didn't speak a word of Urdu or Hindi. And he said that if he would grin, the others would grin, so he decided to grin industrially. So Winston Churchill, he developed a sort of camaraderie with these men that he fought with. And in fact, he later spoke out in his book, The Malacan Field Force. He said that, speaking about a particular sepoy, he argued that this man deserved a Victoria Cross, even though Victoria Crosses at the time were not given to Indians. He suggested that he should get one because under God and sport, all men are equal. So this development, when it occurs with the men he's fighting with, but he also sort of has a battlefield respect with those he's fighting against. He develops a real respect for the tribes of the Euphrates and various other mountain tribes whom he's fighting. That's a picture of an Euphrates tribe at the top there. He develops a real respect for them based on their tenacity on the battlefield. But what's really interesting as well is during his off time, when he wasn't out fighting, he was at play. And I have to thank Alan for letting me use this image. But this is a picture of Churchill playing polo. You can see Churchill there against the Gondola Brigade. This is in, I think, 1896. He wrote to his mother and said that he would have a picture taken in November 1896. They were playing for the Gondola Cup. And during this thing, Churchill develops a real love of polo. This is quite famous. But he played these Muslim teams. He developed quite a sense of camaraderie with his Muslim and Sikh counterpoints during the polo games. And this is one of the things that really impressed the Aga Khan later about Churchill, because he was able to recite the entire Rubaiyat, which is, of course, a Persian poem. And this really impressed the Aga Khan. And there's a particular passage about polo in the Rubaiyat that he says. So this very much left a mark on Churchill. And so Churchill goes to India with sort of standard Victorian prejudices, I would say, about Islam. And that's very evident in many of his early writings home. But as he experiences life with them on the frontier, it sort of changes and sort of evolves. So I'm just going to give you some bits and pieces now, because we'll probably be running short of time. During the 1920s, Churchill becomes colonial secretary, and this is when he literally changes the map of the Middle East. And you can see here the southern demarcation of Jordan, this is known in legend as Winston's hiccup, because when he was drawing the map of the Middle East, he literally, well, supposedly had a hiccup and just let the line continue as it was. So as a part of, he called together the Cairo conference after he developed the Middle East department. And as a part of what they did, he brought in people like T.E. Lawrence, Gertrude Bell, and others, and basically brought them together to sort of determine what the Middle East would be. He also coined the term the Middle East, and that sort of affects how we conceptualize it today. I feel like I've run out of time, so I'm going to end it there. But he has definitely made a mark on the Middle East, and as a result, Winston Churchill is inexorably related and connected to the Islamic world and the resurgence of political Islam. Thank you very much.